Welcome to Bold Solutions, Better Planet. I'm Des Anderson, Director of Alumni Relations for the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences, also known as CEOS. Our discussion today is co-hosted by CEOS and the OSU Alumni Association, and it is in honor of Earth Day 2024. As we begin, I first want to acknowledge that Oregon State University in Corvallis, Oregon is located within the traditional homelands of the Marys River or Ampinafu Band of Kalapuya. Following the Willamette Valley Treaty of 1855, Kalapuya people were forcibly removed from reservations in Western Oregon. And today, living descendants of these people are part of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. Indigenous people are valued contributing members of the Oregon State community and represent multiple sovereign tribes among students, faculty, alumni, and staff. OSU accepts its responsibility for understanding the continuing impact of that history on these communities and is committed in the spirit of self-reflection, learning, reconciliation, and partnership to ensure that this institution of higher learning will be of enduring benefit not only to the state of Oregon, but also to the people on whose ancestral lands it is now located. And as we consider our own relationship to the earth and position on it, let us honor the stewardship that Indigenous people have enacted here since time immemorial, and recognize that Indigenous people continue to hold great knowledge of the natural world passed down from generation to generation, dating back thousands of years. We further recognize that Indigenous peoples are among the communities most threatened by climate change, and we honor their work and leadership in the fight for climate justice. CEOS Earth Day lecture was launched in 2022, and we're delighted to be here for our third year, hearing from alumni on the front lines of creating climate solutions, imagining hope, and strengthening our resiliency in the face of enormous planetary and societal change. Audience, thank you for being here to join us in this conversation. We invite you to share your questions by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Our speakers will answer as many as time allows. And finally, we're very pleased to have Tuba Oskenhaller, Dean of the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences, as our moderator this evening. Welcome, Tuba.
Thank you, Des. Thank you. Thank you very much once again for organizing this, Des. And thank you to the many of you who are here this evening to have a conversation with us in honor of Earth Day. As Des said, my name is Tuba, and I have the privilege and pleasure to be the Dean of OSU's wonderful College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences. Our college here houses programs in oceanography, in geology, in geography, environmental sciences, atmospheric sciences, and climate sciences, and what lies at the intersection of all of these disciplines. All of our work really deals with understanding the earth, understanding how the earth works, and using this improved understanding to really better life for all. So it seems natural that we would be the college within OSU to host a discussion like this in honor of Earth Day. So I'm thrilled to be able to facilitate yet another Earth Day panel discussion this evening with yet 3 more distinguished alumni of our college. Today, our panelists are, once again, 3 alumni of our programs: Arwen Bird, Laura Peters, and Melva Trevino Pena. Instead of me talking and introducing them to you, instead we've asked them to go ahead and do some formal introductions of themselves first before we dive into a conversation. As questions come up, do put them in the Q&A tab. I'm monitoring that tab, and we'll pick up those questions as we go. But know that I have a few questions I want to get in ahead of you all before I dive into you all's questions. So again, thank you for being here. And Arwen, Laura, and Melva, do you want to take it away?
Well, hello, everybody. I think I'm going to start. My name's Arwen Bird, and is there a slide up on? There we go. By way of introduction, I've put together a couple of photos that give you a sense of kind of the journey that led me to where I am right now, on a career path to become a physician assistant, working in primary care. So the three photos reflect different phases of my life. So the one in the upper left-hand side of your screen is when I founded and ran an organization for progressive violence survivors. I was paralyzed in a crash that was caused by somebody who had too much to drink and chose to drive. But I recognized that there needed to be a voice for violence survivors like me who wanted healing responses to violence. So I founded an organization called Crime Survivors for Community Safety, which we later merged with the Partnership for Safety and Justice. And so this group of people that you see are the founding board of that organization. And we, through that merging, became one of the first organizations in the country that advocated for criminal justice policy based on the experiences of survivors, people who are currently and formerly incarcerated, our families and community members, to work on a really transformative policy. And the Partnership for Safety and Justice still is doing that great work today. I left that work and decided that I wanted to return to environmental work and environmental science. And so that's when I returned to Oregon State University and got my master's in marine resource management. And then after that degree, worked for the Northwest Climate Science Center. So that's that picture over on the left-hand side from one of our climate boot camps where graduate students, I worked as the training coordinator to help graduate students and early career professionals be able to hone their science communication skills, research skills, among other. And this is us out in Idaho on Shoshone-Bannock lands, looking at camas and kind of doing an exploration of camas, which is one of the traditional foods of Shoshone-Bannock peoples. And that work actually at the Northwest Climate Science Center led me to doing very similar work for the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians to support them as they created a tribal climate camp for tribal environmental professionals to be able to come together and work for the climate plans that they wanted to do for their tribes. And it looks very different for Native peoples, depending on where they are and what the resources are that they have available in terms of what the actual plan was that they were working on. But it was really, that was the point at which, for me, listening to the stories of people talk about not only their experiences of climate change, but just in the context of, so restricted access to traditional foods, yes, from climate change, but more importantly, in the context of a legacy of colonization and the way that colonization had kind of really curtailed, I guess, for lack of a better word, where people could live and what sort of access to resource they had. And for me, I recognize that I really felt compelled and called at that time to help work on the health side of that equation. That, for me, climate grief is something that we're all experiencing. We're all very aware of. And for me, I really felt called, particularly because of my background working with trauma survivors, to go more directly to helping people heal. And so that's where I found myself returning to school again, and now going toward becoming a physician assistant to work in primary care so that I can help people who are having increased respiratory illness, heat-related illness, all of the different kind of very human dimensions of climate change. And so then the last picture down at the bottom is me and my wheelchair basketball team. I like this picture because it shows a little bit more about me, who I am as a human. I am an athlete and I enjoy playing sport and enjoy working on teams. But it also shows the kind of a vulnerable population. People with disabilities are disproportionately impacted in climate change, as are many vulnerable populations, just by nature of I and many other people with spinal cord injury have difficulty regulating our temperatures just on any good day. And in increased heat events, it becomes that much more challenging for me to figure out how to cool off my body. And that is the same for, many people with different kind of neurologic related conditions. So it's a very personal thing for me, and it also is something that I'm dedicating my life professionally to at this time, is to help people kind of find their way through and heal as we're navigating climate change. So
thank you so much, Arwen, for your story, for sharing your story. Quite inspirational, really. Thank you. Next is Laura.
Thank you, Tuba. Good evening, everyone. It's an honor to be here to talk about bold solutions for a better planet. My name is Dr. Laura Peters, and I'm an assistant professor of geography here at OSU, and of course, also a proud graduate of OSU in 2020. I'm a human geographer, and I'm trained primarily in disaster studies and international peace and conflict resolution. I research, teach, and contribute to actions on disasters, their impacts, including for human health, and the actions we can and must take to prevent them and safeguard people's health and well-being. We cannot eliminate risk ever, but we can do a lot to reduce it systematically. In my Disasters and Divided Societies research lab, we investigate why we see disproportionate disasters and disaster impacts in deeply divided societies. And when I say that, I mean places like conflict and humanitarian zones. That's where about a quarter of the global population lives. And that's about 2 billion people who live in places affected by armed conflict. Research by colleagues has shown that about half of global disaster deaths cumulatively in recent decades has occurred in conflict-affected contexts. Conflict zones are also places of disease emergence, re-emergence, and transmission, with very few resources available to actually support health. Despite the urgent need to reduce disaster risks in these places, the field of disaster risk reduction remains unnervingly silent about conflict and violence. And the current politics of disasters worldwide is to deny that they are political at all and to call them natural. As a result, most understanding is relatively shallow, and best practices are all too often not applicable in places marked by division and disparity. In these places, people deliberately put others in harm's way, whether that's through direct violence or indirectly by marginalizing them, and in doing so, make them more vulnerable to disasters and the effects of climate change. And by the way, we don't need to look very far to find divided societies, unfortunately. We see them here in the United States, and we can find them right here in Oregon. But this doesn't mean that nothing is happening in places that are characterized by catastrophe. There is also ample learning, growth, and progress. So my research focuses on that, the human actions, inactions, and interactions between people and their shared environments to better understand what kind of solutions are effective, sustainable, and inclusive, including where people may not see eye to eye. My work is situated in the fields of disaster risk reduction, as well as disaster diplomacy and environmental peace building. These are fields that see the potential to leverage environmental crises and concerns to build cooperative relationships and help bridge these social and political divides, in addition to reducing the risk of disasters, especially for those who have the most vulnerabilities forced upon them. So this is not a happy side effect, but an urgent aim where conflict is the core driver of disaster risks. Ultimately, my research focuses on and tries to amplify those efforts toward building shared and just futures from the perspectives and experiences of those who are actually impacted by disasters and violence. I work together with a wide variety of partners around the world, including community-led organizations, national and international nonprofit organizations, and the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, for example. One thing that they all share in common, and which inspires me, is their commitment to taking action in some of the most challenging and dangerous places on Earth. These partnerships range from co-developing research with the Irish NGO Goal on early warning and response systems in informal settlements in Tegucigalpa, Honduras, which house over 50% of the capital city's population, as well as co-developing research on environmental peace building in Israel, Jordan, and Palestine with the NGO EcoPeace Middle East. These are just a couple examples to show that even in contexts that may seem impossibly difficult from the outside, there's a lot that can and is being done. People cannot be defined solely by their vulnerabilities, but also by their potentials, capabilities, and strengths. We can learn so much from their experiences and expertise, but perhaps most of all from how they carry hope. And I hope that this is a theme that we can focus on in this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. Whenever you talk about disaster diplomacy and peace building, that is inspiring to me to think of it in those terms. Melva, how about an introduction from you?
Hello, my name is Melva Trevino Peña. I'm an assistant professor in the Sustainable Agriculture and Food Systems program at the University of Rhode Island. I am an CEOS alum, obviously. I graduated from Oregon State in 2018 from the geography department as well. I am also a human geographer and I'm an ethnographer. And here in Rhode Island, I have the Coastal Human Geographies Lab, and I work predominantly in coastal communities. So a lot of people from CEOS who knew me, they've heard a lot about this work that I did in Ecuador. So my research really focuses on working with marginalized communities. I'm really interested in working with underrepresented groups that have historically been left out of decision making. So my work as a PhD student when I was at Oregon State, I worked in Ecuador. I was looking at the impacts of mangrove deforestation, and predominantly they were driven by shrimp aquaculture, but I was also looking at state-led conservation, which was not destroying the mangroves, but in a very similar way as shrimp farming was also dispossessing people from mangrove spaces which are very important for livelihoods, culture of cultural importance, and just in general are key parts of communities in these regions. So more recently, since coming to Rhode Island, actually, ironically, these two photos are from the same year. The last time I went to Ecuador in 2019, and when I started working here in Rhode Island. So I started to realize that a lot of the people that I would talk to about just fishers and coastal access in Rhode Island would tell me stories about how they would consult with communities. But over and over, I started to realize that there was this huge gap because the people that they would be talking to were of the dominant culture. And over, I started to recognize that there's a lot of communities in Rhode Island that have been established here for decades, but historically have been left out again of these decision-making and management. So that's how I started working here in Rhode Island, just by asking a lot of questions and recognizing that there was this need to bring some of the communities that I recognize as being underrepresented. For example, the Latinx community, indigenous communities here are not necessarily consulted very much. Also, there's a huge Southeast Asian community, and more recently, there's been a lot of refugees coming from Central Africa and the Middle East. So that's the work that I've been doing in Rhode Island. I'm focusing on what I'm calling self-provisioning fishers. It took me a long time to land on that title, and by what I mean by that is that a lot of times these folks are considered recreational fishers. They have recreational fishing licenses, but they consume a lot of the fish that they catch. So then people want to categorize them as subsistence fishers, and they don't want to call themselves that. So I come to a more comfortable term that I prefer, which is self-provisioning fishers. So it's people who fish for fun, but they're also consuming the fish, and the fishing in general is of cultural importance to them. So they seemed a little bit unrelated, going from the mangroves to coastal Rhode Island. But what again ties this research together is that in different contexts, I focus on working with communities that historically are left out of conversations. And the biggest problem that I've noticed in both scenarios is that when these communities are not, when they're not taken into consideration, people can make decisions that produce unintended consequences. So that's the tie that brings my research together. And today I'll be talking a little bit about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Melva. Thank you. And at the danger of overusing the term, Melva, what inspires me about your work is your ability to really port an understanding you perceived, attained in one part of the world and carry it off to problems in another part of the world. Okay, let's get this conversation started. Okay, let's talk about the way in which our Earth is changing and evolving and what that means for the communities that are being impacted, right? We are living in these tumultuous times when the Earth system is sort of desperately trying to catch up and reach some sort of equilibrium with the amount of CO2 that's in the atmosphere. And so as a result, what we're seeing is that many communities, communities of place, communities of practice are experiencing what they would term as disasters, right? Wildfires, extreme weather events, storms, and coastal flooding occurrences. So are these really natural disasters? And maybe, Laura, this is a question for you. Can you tell us a little bit more about what is a disaster? What defines a disaster? What is natural about disasters?
Thank you, Tuba, for asking that question. This is the hill I will die on. Disasters are not natural. I am far from the first person to say this, and I will be far from the last person to say it. So over 50 years of disaster studies tells us that disasters are not just a function of a hazard and its magnitude and frequency. It is how these hazards come into and interact with human societies. So it's how hazards, we have in disaster science, we have a pseudo equation to understand, what leads to disaster risk. And it's the hazard times exposure. So you have to be there, you have to experience it. And then there's also vulnerability, which is socially created. And then all of that is underscored by coping capacities. So if we can deal with the situations that we come into contact with, they don't become disasters. They just remain as hazard events and hazard processes when we can manage them. And one really important thing about recognizing this about disasters is that this is sort of where the magic can happen. When we take responsibility for the role that we play in creating vulnerabilities. And these are very differential vulnerabilities that disproportionately are forced upon those who are most marginalized from decision making. Melva talked a little bit about this in her introduction. These are the people who are experiencing the most disasters because of their vulnerabilities. These aren't innate vulnerabilities, but these are things that society creates. These happen at all, as geographers, we think in terms of scale. This happens at all different scales. This is what can help to explain why, for instance, a magnitude 7 earthquake in California in 2019 caused 1 death, whereas the same magnitude earthquake in Haiti in 2010 caused between 100,000 to 300,000 deaths and about $8 billion in damages. So we really don't see disasters as natural in these cases.
Yeah, very good. Thank you for those examples, Laura. Arwen, Melva, in your work, do you sort of see this interesting distinction or really new definition, to me new, of disasters? And maybe also, since both of you work with communities, are there ways of using these concepts to maybe build community or change approaches? What's your experience with that concept? Go ahead, Arwen.
Well, at least for me, like I mentioned this a little bit in my introduction, in working on the tribal climate camps and listening to so many Indigenous communities talk about their experiences, you always have to talk about colonization. You know, we have to talk about the context of, you know, the last few centuries of time and where people have been kind of forced to live. You know, so that's for, you know, certainly for Native communities. I've also done work on gentrification, just very specifically here in Portland, and thinking about redlining and where certain communities were kind of pushed to live within the city of Portland, predominantly the African American community, and then looking at, you know, issues like water quality, and, you know, we can see that pattern play out time and again. So yes, I've absolutely seen that. And then, you know, you recognize then down the line, I'm working currently in oncology, and just that's specifically around pollution, but yeah, there are increased exposures that people have that then they end up in the healthcare system with cancers or, you know, other illnesses, but it's not, it doesn't happen by chance.
Yeah. So there's the natural event, the vulnerability, the exposure. Melva, do you have some examples or thoughts?
Yeah, I really like Laura the way of framing disasters, because I also think, well, that they're human made. Then I think when people think of natural disasters, like we think of like an earthquake or hurricane or like tsunamis, like these giant events that take place and, you know, are present on the news or something. But I feel like sometimes like bringing the aspect of scale that Laura also mentioned, like that can look very different at various levels. And it made me think when you were saying earlier, Arwen, about like limits to food access that are like food that is culturally appropriate for communities, like that is a disaster for them. We're not labeling it a disaster and it's not on the news, but that is a disaster. Or for example, here in Rhode Island, Central Falls is one of the places. It's a community. It's outside of Providence, which is in the metro area. It's a community that is highly community of color. Historically, that's been like a Black communities have lived there. A lot of Latinx communities have established there. Central Falls is one of the most diverse areas in Rhode Island. It's also one of the towns or the areas in the country with the highest levels of lead in the soil. So these are disasters that happen to people at very small scales, and they have really individual impacts. So in reality, like some of them could almost be avoidable. Like some of the impacts of those disasters could be avoidable. That's why I really like Laura's definition that sometimes we think of disasters as like these things that happen and we have no control over, when in reality, it's very much crafted by us. Like we are the reason that like the disasters are happening, and disproportionately they happen to communities of color. They happen to marginalized communities. Those are the communities that are living at the front lines, at the more polluted areas, at the most hazardous areas. So it's when we define a disaster from that lens, then the conversation completely shifts, right? Then you can have conversation about how to be more prepared. It's a very different thing than just like, you know, saying that there's no way we can prepare for these events. We are in some areas we're more prepared than others. So I really like framing it like that and thinking about what that could look like at different scales.
Yeah. One other thing I think of this framing is that we're not helpless, right? Natural hazards, you know, the disaster it's not something that we cannot prevent. In fact, we should. And there is a question now in the Q&A that sort of is asking a clarifying question, so I will pose this. Would you say then that natural hazards only become disasters with the presence of humans and impacts different communities differently based on their systemic vulnerabilities? With this definition, is there such a thing as a natural disaster? Very, you know, probing here.
I would be happy to jump in.
Go for it.
So there's thanks for asking this wonderful question. There's a whole kind of like group of people, including the UN, and including there's a global campaign, that's the word I'm searching for, against using the term natural disasters. So the UN, for instance, has banned the use of natural disasters. Academic journals that focus on disaster studies You're not supposed to say natural disasters because it's seen as a misnomer. So we talk about natural hazard related disasters. We can talk about disasters related to climate change, which is often seen as a hazard influencer rather than the actual driving cause of disasters. And one other aspect of your question, your excellent question that I wanted to respond to is also the vulnerability side of things. It's really important to see vulnerabilities as dynamic. They're changing. They change at different points of the day, different points of your life, depending on where you are. You know, we've talked a little, the other panelists have talked also about exposure. This changes depending on where you're walking, where you're living, where you're spending your day, where you go back to at night. And so this is a very dynamic, always shifting, always changing thing. So there are systematic and systemic drivers of vulnerabilities, but there's also a lot of other things that are going on that cause vulnerabilities.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you for that, Laura. So you each, as you were introducing yourselves, touched upon the fact that some of your work really relates to impacts on marginalized communities, and you all mentioned different communities that you've worked with. Can you maybe dive a little bit more deeper into maybe one example of what that looks like, in the sense that you know, how your work relates to marginalized or underserved communities, and what you have found out in terms of how maybe our audience can understand what plays out compared to more dominant communities?
I can start. So again, going back to scale as a geographer, but I think who is marginalized really depends on scale. I think if we're thinking about the global level, like, yes, the global north is not the marginalized in that scenario. It's the global south, especially the less developed countries, as they're called sometimes in the global south, are the most marginalized. But I feel like also, like, there are marginalized communities. Like, sometimes you talk about communities and we're like, well, what do you mean by community? It's such a blanket term. And even within communities, there are people who are more marginalized than others. So, for example, the work that I did in Ecuador, as at the community, quote unquote, community level, they're all marginalized at the state level, like Ecuador's level, because they're rural or coastal communities. But even within that community, that wasn't very large, I found that women were the most marginalized by these changes and the most affected, and specifically women with young children, for example, were the most affected because they lost access to a resource that sustained them in the past. So I think that it's important to think about scale when we think of marginalized. But one of the bigger issues to me, rather than, like, sometimes actually I've heard people don't like the label marginalized, they don't want to label themselves that. What I really have shifted to think more about is their underrepresentation, and that comes from marginalization. But what I want to focus more is on understanding those people and those groups that have historically not been consulted with, and trying to see if we can bring them to the table. And perhaps their issues and their concerns are not going to be addressed overnight, but I think that oftentimes people, just by not bringing them, you're creating a lot of harm. And that's why I'm really interested in more on the underrepresented, or the people who are historically just left out of conversations. So I kind of brought up a couple of things there, but it leaves enough for Arwen and Laura to maybe pick up.
Yeah, Melva, thank you. That's really insightful, your thoughts about scale. Laura, Arwen, do you have thoughts on this?
Well, I'll just speak specifically around disability. And one of the things that I've always said is that, you know, when you make things accessible, you don't restrict access. So I think that kind of thinking can apply in this context as well, where you actually create benefit and you don't even really recognize even some of the benefits. So if something simple structurally, like if you build a ramp, you know, you think you're just improving access for people who use wheelchairs and mobility devices, but kids like to play on ramps too. And, you know, like there are a lot of benefits that come from that kind of thinking. And I think that we could scale that up to thinking, you know, if we are just, again, centering disability, and we're thinking about just heat tolerance and how to create spaces, you know, for people to be able to better regulate temperature. If we're just focusing on people who might have difficulty regulating their temperature, you know, if you're talking about creating parks or cooling shelters or, you know, various kind of access points for cooling, then you've also created spaces for people that everybody can benefit from. So I think for me, I like thinking relationally, thinking kind of human-centered, and that it doesn't, yes, I too, it is difficult to be even refer to myself as a person with a disability as being more vulnerable, because I don't like thinking of myself as less than. I think that's, you know, true for many of us who might have an identity that, but at the same time, yeah, you know, I have difficulty regulating my temperature, you know, so, and I think for the same way when I'm working with patients, you know, to just recognize their humanity, and that there are different dimensions of their humanity that we need to regard and center. And so we can create solutions that center human needs and then create kind of concomitant benefit when we do that.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Arwen. Laura, do you have any thoughts on this question?
Yes, I'm happy to jump in. So my other hat is that I serve as the research director of STEMMA, which is a disruptive research group on global and community health that's based in London. And we're conducting right now participatory action research on collective forms of health in places that are extremely marginalized around the world. So these are places, and thank you, Melva, for the food for thought about, you know, using, I also have a discomfort with using the word marginalized, though tend to prefer that over, you know, more common phrases of under-resourced or places with low resources, which makes it seem like it's just, they just naturally live in a desert, which is not the case, because these places may not have traditional, you know, conventional forms of resources and solutions, but we're working with community-based leaders, community partners in these various locations, and trying to understand from their own perspectives and experiences the paths for well-being and sustainability that they are forging in their own communities in the faces of really big changes and challenges like climate change. And you know, one of the important things that I really focus on in this research is that we can define health as sort of the absence of disease or the absence of disability, the absence of, you know, something. But that doesn't, you know, and as Arwen, I'm sure, can add to this, that doesn't actually capture health. We're working on trying to develop better understandings of collective health, better understandings of positive health, and bringing those together. And positive health is this idea that health should actually refer to the presence of something that makes people feel like they're thriving and fully alive. And so challenges like climate change not only affect the disease part of our understanding of health, but it also impacts the positives of health. And in some ways, in really unexpected ways, where facing certain challenges can actually bring communities closer together and identify the resources that they have available to them, which are always going to be better than external interventions that, you know, as Melva's talked about, where local communities and people who live there are often not consulted. They're not included in data. They're not included in any kind of decision making. It's just, you know, groups that show up and think that they have the solution for someone else's problem. And we're finding very expectedly that is not the case.
Yeah, very, very well said. The three of you are talking. It strikes me that you all, you know, coming back maybe also to what Melva said about scale, some of your comments pertain to rural communities, some of your comments pertain to urban communities. And that reminded me that there was a question that one of our attendees provided when they actually signed up. There was an opportunity to do so, that maybe we can pivot to. And that question is, what are the differences among urban and rural communities and how they engage with issues and empower themselves? Is that something you all can speak to? What do you think? Arwen, you certainly work more in urban communities, it sounded like, and Melba, you've worked in very rural communities. But maybe none of you has done both?
I've worked in both, and but I'm trying to think, I think the distinction, because I think, working with the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians and working with all the many nations that came through the climate boot camps, some it was more like culturally relative, in terms of how people approached whatever climate programming they needed for their tribe was just really specific to the culture of their tribe and what were the resources they had available. So admittedly, some of those tribes and the places they were planning for would be considered more of a rural area. And some also kind of bordered on urban areas as well. But what I appreciated was, what we tried to create for people at the tribal climate camps was just a container that they could come and that they knew best what they needed to be able to create for their community. Some of it was sending staff, some of it was sending youth and elders, like people who they sent were really different based on what the needs for their community were.
Yeah.
So
what I'm hearing you say maybe, Arwen, is that this rural-urban division isn't a real one when it comes to this kind of work, that's not really a distinguisher.
Yeah, I think it might be kind of I don't know. I don't want to like up to it. We need to be more nuanced and also, to create a basket that can hold everybody and that you get to come and to articulate what it is that you need within that context for your community.
Yeah, in whatever ways make sense for your community. Yeah, very good. And that not every urban community is, similar, that there are maybe intersectionalities there, right? Or vice versa for rural. Very good. I have another question from the audience. Our audience member is thinking that during both acute and chronic crises, it seems they feel like people don't panic so much. Instead, they are just responding based on their level of training and experience. Are there good examples of how the general public is being encouraged to be more informed on the issues involved so that their responses are more supportive of good outcomes for their own communities? Interesting. Maybe we can think of that question in the context of a natural hazard event or a more more slowly evolving climate change related event like sea level rise. Yeah, how do we get the general public more engaged and informed?
I can respond to that. I can start off with a response. So I really like the framing of this question, and it's one that I really agree with, that people don't panic. In the events of acute and chronic crises, it's far more, people are always the first responders. That's one thing that, to keep in mind, that before, the professionalized services arrive, it's always the people who are right there, who are experiencing whatever it is, they are responding to it. And people have, by and large, a much larger tendency toward acting altruistically and helping their neighbors, helping people in their vicinity when they come into contact with disasters. The media, of course, tends to focus on the other side. So we see a lot of often false reports of looting, false reports of violence and crime following disasters. And that's, much less often than we would be led to believe. And going back to scale, we think often there's a lot of concerns that conflict affected places that wow, if a disaster happens, that's just going to cause a bunch of conflict. And that is a very overblown concern as well. So I just wanted to make that mention. And then as far as my own work goes, I can draw from the example of early warning and response systems in Tegucigalpa. These are places that are broadly controlled by territorial gangs, very high levels of violence, very high levels of distrust between formal governance compared with places that are the informal settlements that are broadly controlled by gangs, and governance that kind of weaves back and forth between formal and informal. And one really outstanding thing is that the NGO that I worked with for this research project, they spent about 10 years of time really working with communities and working within these broader systems of governance to try to build that trust. A lot of their work centered on awareness building. So, for instance, they would go door to door and give people detailed understandings of the actual risk that they lived in which many people were unaware that they lived in places that were highly vulnerable to floods and landslides. So giving them like a really good sense of, this is the risk that you have, these are the actions that you take, and then delivering early warnings in a variety of different ways that actually corresponded with what people trusted, what people had access to, because there's a lot of mistrust during situations where there are official calls for people to leave their houses, because they may not have a very safe place to go. They may be temporarily displaced to somewhere that's very violent or somewhere that there's a lot of uncertainty. And the second is that often around the world, there's something we call forced evictions, or slum clearance is kind of the slang term for it, where governments, state governments, city governments, they often use disasters as sort of a scapegoat for evicting people from their homes and not letting them go back. And so there's a lot of concerns about this. So there's a lot of trust building that needs to happen. There's a lot of outreach and awareness, and getting people actually involved in their own risk reduction helps them to really understand, well, in these situations, you really do need to leave. Otherwise, you'll be unsafe in your home, just for an example.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. Let's talk a little bit more about this concept of trust building. That must be something both Melva and Arwen, you have to have engaged in as you're working with communities that you get involved with. Tell me more.
What is the question?
Trust building. What does it look like to be able to build trust with the communities that you work with?
So a lot of people assume I'm from the communities I work with because I'm Latina. When I was at Oregon State, people thought I was Ecuadorian because I was doing work in Ecuador. I'm actually from Mexico. The first time I went to Ecuador was for research. I didn't travel there. I just went there for research. And then even here in Rhode Island, I've been in meetings with like regional, I guess, state managers of different agencies. And in one meeting, one guy was like, "Oh, your community." I was like, "These are not my community. I just got here a couple of years ago. Like, I'm not from Rhode Island. I'm from the border. Like, these are not my community. Like, just because we all speak Spanish doesn't mean that I immediately am their community." So I think that people just assume that because of my positionality as like a Latina, Mexican American, like I just show up and people like are immediately my community. That's not how it works. So for me, it definitely, like, who I am and my background helps me build connections because I show up. I don't show up as a researcher. I show up as me. I do talk about working with the university, but ironically, I just had this conversation yesterday on another panel that another alumni organized, who's in the audience, T. Trung, and it was with community engaged scholars. And I said that the biggest thing for me that I feel like all researchers working with communities need to do and to have above everything, like training, sure, training's good. The one thing you need to have is humility. So if you show up with humility to these communities and you engage with people and they can see that they can relate to you, the more distance that you put between them and you, the less that they're going to be able to relate with you. So if you show up and you're like, "I'm an academic," unless you're showing up to talk to other academics, you're creating these boundaries between you and them. So I think for me, it's about showing up and listening and showing genuine interest and curiosity and genuine concern for what their needs are. And that's how I've been able to build trust with people in Ecuador, people in Rhode Island, that again are not my communities, but I show up and I ask questions and I listen a lot and I genuinely show that I care. And that has gotten me really, really far. And I think that again, it's that disposition that you have. I don't show up to tell them, I have a lot of answers. I'm here to tell you all these things that you don't know. I feel like typically that doesn't work really well.
Yeah. Thank you, Melva. That genuine desire to actually learn from these communities, the people who have had this lived experience, feels like that's really, really important. Arwen, do you have anything to add to that? I was seeing you nodding.
To be honest, not really. I think Melva said it really well. Like 100% what Melva said. Be humble. Listen.
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. No, I mean, I'm a little tongue in cheek, but yes, honestly, yeah, I take the same approach, and I've worked across cultures and identities over the years, and I think that is the single most. And maybe if I would add one thing, is to try and be as self-aware as you can. Be aware of your own culture, whatever kind of which is difficult to if it's the first time that maybe anybody's even suggested that to you, but to just be aware of your own culture so that you can approach with respect,
Yeah.
Not just make assumptions.
Very good. Thank you, Arwen. So just for our audience, we have quite a few folks in our audience, and many of them are not researchers or academics or people who are working necessarily in this sort of space of how natural disasters and societies are intertwined. But we do live in an area, and I'm sure many of our attendees are from Oregon, so we live in an active tectonic zone. Others might be from places where there are other natural hazards that are looming or right around the corner. Do you have any advice for folks who are not necessarily engaging in the research around disasters, but who want to be well prepared, who want to work within their own communities? Are there some things you can think about that we can suggest to them as things that they can engage in?
Well, at least for me, I'll just jump in, and this is like I'll take your question, but maybe add a little bit in terms of just the reality of when we come to a deeper understanding about what we're facing with climate change, regardless, I'm sensing that if people are here, that they are aware that climate change is happening. We're very much living in this changing environment. And there are emotions that arise related to that. When we recognize the totality of climate change, we recognize the way that communities are being disproportionately impacted, based on kind of these people-made aspects. So for me, I would encourage people to go where they need to go to heal those feelings, to be aware of those emotions and to take care of them. This is the self-help portion of the talk. I think for any of us that are working in this field, at least for me, it's part of the reason that I chose to go into healthcare. Because I recognized that I kind of needed to get out of my head a little bit more and go more into my body as far as working with people. And I think that, just the work that I've done with trauma survivors in the past, it's helpful for me personally to just be with people, because I think we can hear all these stories over and over and over again. And it was very, it's just very challenging for me emotionally, but actually going and helping people make sure that they have their asthma medication and that they can treat their respiratory illness is healing for me. Hopefully it's a both and. So however that looks for any one person listening to this would be just to connect to your heart, connect to your feelings, and then to figure out, what action you might take that could be healing for yourself as well as preparatory, or help you better prepare. So
Thank you for that insight, Arwen. Any thoughts from Melva or Laura?
I want to add something. It's not, I swear I'm not trying to be like, let's just be positive. But the truth is, I really believe that none of us are powerless. We all have the capacity to do something. Some people, depending on their resources, they can go to other countries, other geographies and work with communities there. But there's needs in our own communities. There's needs where we live too. And for me, I came from a low income background. I didn't travel the world ever. My first time going internationally anywhere was when I went to Ecuador for my research. And at Oregon State, I went to Canada for a conference. I went to Chile for a conference. I went to Ecuador 3 times for my research. And I'm very grateful for that. But one of the things that got me thinking more about the US as well is in 2018, it was the first time that at the American Association of Geographers, there was a new specialty group called the Latinx geographies. And it's different from Latin American geographies in the sense that it focuses on the diaspora of Latinx people in the US and Canada predominantly. But one of the things that they were saying that really stuck with me, and it really, that's why I'm doing work in Rhode Island, is that they said, a lot of us are sometimes so like drawn to go to these faraway places, going back to what Arwen was saying about colonialism, like that, to think about that. I'm going to go and rescue all these poor people in the South, the global South. But in reality, we have a lot of communities of need here in the United States where you live. So for me, I think that there's different capacities that we all have. As researchers, we have a lot of, especially working at universities, we have access to funds. We can apply for grants. We can get ourselves to a lot of places. But I recognize that not everybody has that. And I don't think you need to have access to a lot of money. I think it's just willingness to want to learn about what's going on in your own communities. I think there's a lot of need where we live. There's a lot of people who are marginalized in Corvallis or here in Rhode Island, which is as big as probably your county over there. It's such a small state. But like, there are communities that also have need. And I feel like we don't need to go across the globe to do something to support people. So it kind of also goes to that question that the last person asked about, there's like this dichotomy of local versus global communities. I think that we all have different capacities, but we shouldn't be shying away from doing something where we live.
Very good, Melva. Thank you for that. This is all very thoughtful. And Laura, we're running out of time. Any quick closing thoughts from you before I turn it back over to Des?
Yes, I'll very briefly say big +1 to Arwen and Melva for your responses. So completely in agreement and also inspired by what you've shared. And just getting back to kind of the broader themes of what we've been talking about, when we think about disasters and climate change and taking action on those, we can't get away from thinking about power and those systems of power that create the problems that everyone else has to deal with. But I want to encourage all of you, and especially those who are thinking about, well, what's my place in all of this, to think about how having a more expansive understanding of what power actually is. Power is not just something that people exert over other people. Power is something that we create with each other. That's something that we share together. It's something that we have power to do things. We have power from systems of oppression. And so I would really urge you to just connect with, well, what kinds of systems of power are you a part of and can you create? Because it's not just about calling out and recognizing that there are these other systems of very destructive forms of power, but it's also about creating something new. And that ultimately has to be something that we create together.
Wow. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Melva, Arwen. I feel like I learned a lot during this 1 hour, and I'm hoping that our audience thinks the same. There were a lot of questions we weren't able to get to, but I really appreciated the in-depth conversation we were able to have. And with that, it is 7 o'clock. I'll turn it over for Des for quick closing comments.
Yeah, I don't think there's much I can add to that, but just really want to thank you, Tuba, for moderating this really important and inspiring conversation. And for our audience, thank you for bringing your curiosity and your comments and your questions. And let's just give a virtual round of applause to our outstanding alumni panelists, Arwen, Laura, Melva. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and for the wonderful ways that you're working for a better planet for all of us. You're such a great example of Beavers. and to be other beavers everywhere. And happy Earth Day. Go Beavs.